everybody. Today we'll be talking about the restructuring of geopolitics through the emergence of a new pole. Now, in international relations, the question of where power lies or in which state power can be found or located is quite a difficult and complex one. And this is because international relations are essentially the relations between independent, sovereign and equal states. So it is very difficult to predictably say on a permanent or even a long-term basis that power is located in this one state. In general, however, the concept of polarity essentially has to do with the distribution of power in the world. So scholars have essentially defined three types of polarity. There is multipolarity, which essentially is the presence of multiple centers of power, bipolarity or the presence of two centers of power, or unipolarity, which is the presence of one center of power. So the point to be noted here is that even when scholars have at one point pointed to this one state and said that this is the center of power, this is a unipolar actor, at that same time there have come about the emergence of other states that have been slowly and gradually amassing power and resources who would eventually make unipolarity impossible. In general, however, scholars are more or less agreed on some instances of unipolarity and bipolarity. So when we talk about unipolarity, after the Cold War and the long détente, most scholars agree that the United States of America arose as a unipolar actor. And this is because at that time, with the USSR disintegrating, economically crippled and ideologically marooned, the USA did not really have a challenger of its equal capabilities in the world. At the same time, because the USA had such powerful commercial presence in international commercial organizations such as the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, or the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, and also because of the fact that the dollar became the reserve of the global reserve of for foreign exchange, essentially, it became very difficult for any other country to challenge the USA. The USA also developed a very powerful blue water navy, an extremely powerful nuclear first strike capability, and is the largest spender in the world on their defense budget. So the US spends an enormous amount on defense research and development. Most importantly, the USA basically possesses unparalleled capacities to project power in international relations. So obviously for a lot of scholars, it is difficult for the USA to find a challenger to its immense power and authority. During the Cold War, however, again most scholars are agreed that the power in the world was divided within two blocks or two centers. On the one hand, we had the USA, the UK and other Western capitalist states more or less under the NATO, whereas on the other we had the Soviet bloc under the Warsaw Pact, which had the Soviet Union, and other states which more or less followed the communist way of economy, or essentially other ways of economy that were not capitalists. So basically at that time the world was ideologically split into two camps, into two different conceptions on how to construct the economy, the society and the polity. However, after the end of the Cold War and the end of the détente, as I said, while some scholars do agree that the USA emerged as the only unipolar actor, and perhaps that is true because immediately afterwards there really was no challenger to the USA, a lot of scholars have pointed to the slow but sure rise of countries like India, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, who essentially are slowly accumulating the resources to become very important centers of power in themselves. So for these scholars, the world is, after the Cold War and in our contemporary times, the world is multipolar. Now, over the next few minutes, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to provide you with a fresh perspective, and I'm going to tell you that China, Pakistan, Russia and Iran are forming a new pole with China as the leader. And this new pole, for a lot of experts, would have the capacity to challenge US unipolarity and return the world into a somewhat bipolar status. So over the next few minutes, essentially what I'll discuss with you is whether or not China will be able to challenge the USA, and what are the strategies and what are the involvements it has had in international relations that would make it able to do so. So when we talk about US versus China bipolarity, we have to remember that US versus China bipolarity is significantly different from the US versus USSR bipolarity. And the reason for this is because the Chinese and the US economies are deeply intertwined. The US and China do follow a lot of economic cooperation and collaboration. Whereas for the USSR, during the Cold War, the USA's only economic policy was containment and isolation. But for China, especially after China opened up its economy in the 1970s, the USA looked to China as a powerful regional ally against, at that point, a powerful Russia as well. So essentially, how does China differ from the USSR in terms of this bipolarity conversation? USA has lesser degree of ideological hostility with China and has higher rates of economic cooperation, more integrated economic cooperation networks with China. Secondly, China also compares more favorably than the USSR when it comes to forming a viable challenger to the USA in this entire system of polarity in terms of material assets. China commands more than 13% of the global GDP. It is also the second largest military spender after the USA. It owns a huge number of nuclear warheads that are capable of breaching the US coast. Finally, it has also developed an integrated system of civic and infrastructure and connectivity projects all across the region through its One Belt, One Road initiative that has really earned it the friendship of a lot of regional partners. I will discuss the OBOR in a bit with you. So, essentially the reason why most scholars believe that China is able to effectively counter the USA is because of the complexity of the strategies that it has used to do so. Because China has essentially realized that it cannot counter the USA head on. It can't do it overtly because firstly it would probably lose, and secondly it would lose prestige in the eyes of the international community, which it cannot afford to do. So what China has done instead is that it has utilized existing international institutional frameworks to, on the one hand, pragmatically accommodate the USA's policies, while on the other hand, ideologically opposing them. How has it done so? In the first thing that it has done, is that it has completely enhanced its participation in regional organizations. So now, before the mid-1990s, China was quite hesitant to engage multilaterally. So essentially, it would prefer to engage bilaterally with other countries. But after the mid-1990s, China began to participate in a massive manner in organizations such as the APEC, which is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, or the ASEAN Plus 3, which is the Association of Southeast Nations Plus 3, which is essentially China, Japan and South Korea, or the ASEAN Plus 1, which is ASEAN plus China. So essentially what China has done is that it has emerged as a powerful driver of transformation in this region, in the Asia Pacific. The second thing that China has done is that it has increased its participation and involvement intensely in international monetary organizations like the IMF or the WTO. So essentially what this has allowed China to do is that of course it has had a few short-term goals, like it has had lower borrowing rates or higher chances of having agreed upon FTAs or free trade agreements. But China has also done this because it would allow China several long-term goals as well. It would allow China to set agendas for gradualist reform policies in the world, and more importantly, it would allow China to affect changes in the very rules, in the very structure of how international finance is conducted. So, as a corollary of this, what this has allowed China to do is that it has allowed China to marshal its immense political, diplomatic and economic resources to signal alarm in the world, in the international community, about the excesses of US hegemony and the problems that are associated with an over-dependence on the dollar as the foundation of the global reserve of foreign exchange. So essentially what it has signaled alarm about is that $2 trillion, more than $2 trillion of China's foreign exchange is based in the US Treasury and in other dollar denominated bonds. So what happens if the dollar loses its value? And this is a concerning thing for America as well, because if China loses faith in the dollar, other countries will follow, the value of the dollar will fall, inflation rates will rise, borrowing rates will rise, and the American economy will basically crumble because the government won't be able to fund social security schemes. People won't be able to pay their mortgages. So even though, of course, this is a faraway eventuality, if it ever has to happen, the dollar is not losing its value in the near future, but China has prepared against that and has been offering the renminbi, which is the Chinese currency, as an alternative to the dollar. It has also formalized the Chiang Mai initiative in East Asia, which is a $125 million currency swap between the ASEAN plus three countries, in order to essentially form a sort of a regional financial security arrangement, which would essentially supplement the lending facilities of the IMF. So what it would basically do is that it would protect the region from economic crisis, even if it affected the rest of the world. The fourth thing that China has basically done is that it has realized that, of course, it is important to combat the USA militarily speaking or economically speaking, but it has also realized that it is extremely essential to combat the USA in the ideational sphere. So China is essentially at this point creating alternative and often opposing international norms of conduct, alternative to the United States of America. China has understood that it is only through being able to socialize the international community into the Chinese perspective of or worldview of how to organize society, economy and polity. It is only through this that China will be able to procure the legitimacy it needs to rise to global ascendancy. So China has done this through, increased participation in the United Nations, through participation in the United Nations peacekeeping forces, through passing human rights resolutions in the UNG or UN General Assembly. The final thing that China has done, that is a corollary of this continuation of this need or this desire, and an often successful desire to essentially acquire legitimacy in the region, is that it has built the OBOR or the One Belt One Road initiative, which, as I said, is basically an interconnected network of roadways, railways, gas and oil pipelines and fiber optic cables that essentially connect through this entire East Asian, Southeast Asian, Central Asian region. And the perspective and what the OBOR essentially is that China essentially enters into agreements with all the countries that are in this entire route, and it essentially invests heavily into their infrastructure, into their essentially civic amenities, and it builds extremely technologically superior roads and railways. So on the one hand, of course, the countries benefit from this arrangement because obviously jobs are being created, their civic infrastructure is bettering, and on the other hand, China wins the support of all of these countries and it gains access through their territories. Indeed, the USA is now finding it much difficult to command the same amount of legitimacy it did in a lot of countries where China has built technologically superior civic infrastructure like Pakistan and Bangladesh, because what China has done through the OBOR is that it has allowed itself to have or command massive influence in the societies, polities, economies, and indeed the way of life of a lot of people in all of these countries. So essentially, why a lot of scholars believe that China could form a viable alternative or as a challenge to the United States of America is because it has offered to the world an alternative perspective on how to construct the world order. It has offered the Asian culture and Asian language as an alternative to the Western imposed culture and language. It has also offered to a lot, and especially this the global south is full of these countries, non-democratic, underdeveloped, small countries. It has offered to these countries a model of development that is based on its own model of combining authoritarianism with gradualist reform policies. So obviously this model of development has perhaps been more acceptable or more essentially doable for these countries, for these small countries, than the model of development that was being presented to them by the West. Most importantly, what China has essentially done is that when it is lending aid, or when it is either lending finances, or it is essentially sending aid, financial monetary aid to these countries, it doesn't accompany them with any social or political preconditions. So when the West, for example, gives aid or gives loans, essentially what it does is that in some cases essentially it accompanies them with the political precondition of democratization, or that the country will need to guarantee to its citizens certain civic and political rights to get this aid. China doesn't accompany its aid or its loan with any of such kinds of preconditions. So for a lot of non-democratic, underdeveloped countries who would prefer not to forcefully democratize themselves, the Chinese way of doing things is of course a much better, much more appreciated, viable alternative. Now, for a lot of scholars, a big reason why China is being able to rise as a global hegemon is because of how it essentially deals with the crises that have occurred in the region. So when there has been crisis, what China has essentially done is that it has emerged as a leader in being able to effectively combat it. So the first crisis that we can talk about, most importantly, is the crisis in Afghanistan. So after the hasty withdrawal of United States troops in 2021 and the equally hasty takeover of the Afghan state by the Taliban, Afghanistan did face a lot of isolation from the rest of the world. In this environment, led by China, Russia, Iran and Pakistan called for what they called a unified approach to dealing with the imminent humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. So while China didn't formally recognize the Taliban government, it was evident through Foreign Minister Wang Yi as well as President Xi Jinping's statements that China essentially wanted to work with these other countries to build a broad-based political framework to be able to deal well with the Afghan situation. So essentially what Wang Yi as well as Xi Jinping called for was that to use the existing frameworks of organizations such as the United Nations or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is the SCO, or the SCO Afghanistan Contact Group, or legal instruments like the Convention on Combating Extremism to be able to mitigate the crisis of extremism in Afghanistan. So here essentially where China was able to have advantage over a lot of other Western countries is because instead of isolating or attempting to contain the Taliban, China, alongside with Russia, Iran and Pakistan, constructively engaged with them. So they met with the Taliban directly or with direct communication on various occasions, and they essentially entered into various agreements which would ensure that they would essentially give up their ties to extremism, to terrorist groups and to drug trafficking or narcotics trafficking essentially. So essentially in this scenario, what China was doing was that it was trying to form a framework through which a lot of these different countries could engage constructively with the Taliban and essentially find a solution to this problem. This call for unity was also echoed by Sergei Lavrov, who is Wang Yi's Russian counterpart, who also then called for the involvement of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, which includes all the countries in the SCO plus Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, as well as countries like Armenia and Belarus. And the point here again essentially was to have a united approach in dealing with Afghanistan. China was also the first country to provide over 200 million yen in humanitarian aid, which is basically food as well as medicines, which is essentially the COVID-19 vaccines, to Afghanistan in this period of crisis. What China also called for in the international sphere is to essentially lift the sanctions on Afghanistan and to unfreeze Afghan assets so as to allow Afghan reconstruction. So obviously for Afghanistan, Russia and China specifically arose to be extremely important regional partners. So essentially what China was able to do is that it was able to essentially utilize or instrumentalize a crisis situation in the region for its own benefit. It was able to essentially now basically have a friendly Afghanistan to itself. Now, the involvement of Iran in this entire thing is also very important, not the least because the Abraham Raisi government essentially has irked the USA on various occasions and does have similar political proclivities with China, but also because Iran does have experience in dealing with the ISK, which is the Islamic State Khorasan, in Iraq and in Syria. Iran has also been deeply troubled by heavy US sanctions on itself. So, of course, Iran's involvement in this and the fact that China was able to bring Iran into this entire dealing with the Taliban in a unified manner also speaks a lot about China's ability to lead alliances in the region. And of course, the final participant in this is Pakistan, and Afghanistan is of extreme importance to Pakistan, specifically because of the fact that Afghanistan is obviously on Pakistan's border. So any extremism in Afghanistan would of course likely spill over to Pakistan as well, and it would destabilize the Pakistani political system too. So of course it was in Pakistan's personal interest as well to ensure that extremism in Afghanistan is contained to the extent possible. This is Pakistan's explanation for this. For China, of course, because Pakistan is ideologically and geographically closer to Afghanistan than China, Pakistan was an extremely important ally or an important partner in China's dealings with Afghanistan. Secondly, through Afghanistan, Pakistan and China, this China-Pakistan economic corridor passes. Now the CPEC is a part of the OBOR, which, as I said, is an interconnected network of roadways, railways, fiber optic cables and gas and oil pipelines. So China was of course afraid that if there is instability in Afghanistan, it would threaten the stability of the CPEC, on which China has made absolutely massive investments. So obviously it was necessary to protect the security of the CPEC, and that is why that is one of the biggest reasons that China also engaged with Pakistan in dealing with Afghanistan. China was also afraid that the Afghanistan crisis would spill over to its own Xinjiang region, where there is already an instability and an insurgency in play. So China basically wanted to utilize Pakistan as an ally to be able to deal more constructively with the Taliban, and that is what Pakistan did. Pakistan did allow there to be closer connections between the Taliban and between China and Russia, whereas China also helped settle a lot of disputes between the Pakistan and the Taliban. So essentially, as I said, what China did in this scenario is that when confronted with a regional crisis, it essentially marshaled surrounding countries or partner countries to deal with it effectively. So for a lot of international countries, regardless of their perspectives about China in other things, most countries do agree that in dealing directly with the Taliban or in dealing constructively with the Taliban, China did to an extent account for some amount of regional peace. As I said, this therefore adds to the entire legitimacy argument of China. The second thing that China has done or China has been involved in is a new regional security pact that consists of China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan and Turkey to counter the existing quadrilateral security dialogue or the Quad. Now the Quad is essentially a multi-state regional security agreement to essentially balance the regional security of the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific. So it consists of various economic and military agreements between India, Japan, Australia and the USA, aiming to essentially, as I said, secure the Asia Pacific and balance against China in the region. So of course in the recent years, Quad has been weakening due to differing geopolitical perspectives. And indeed, after Australia had exited many years ago, and now of course there have been problems with India as well, the Quad essentially is weakening as a whole. For a lot of scholars, the vacuum that has been left in this entire regional security debate in the Indo-Pacific could be filled by this new regional security agreement between China, Russia, Iran, Turkey and Pakistan. This agreement hasn't yet come to fruition, but of course for a lot of scholars this would be a completely viable alternative to the Quad in the region. And essentially at the core of this regional security arrangement are the grievances and contentions that every member of this new regional security arrangement have with other members of the Quad. So each member in this new arrangement has some grievance or the other with one member in the Quad essentially. So for Russia and China in particular, they are concerned about the fact that if the Quad is not balanced in the Indo-Pacific, then they themselves would be contained and isolated in the region, which would decimate their economies. So for example, the Russian ministers have protested against what they called anti-China games that were being played by the Quad. China has essentially criticized the Quad for essentially forming enclosed small cliques that they believe would break apart regional security in this area. So obviously for these two countries, it is in their best interest that they can form an alternative regional security arrangement that would work better for them than the Quad. Now, of course, the involvement of Iran again here is important because of the fact that the relationships between Iran and the United States of America have been consistently deteriorating, especially after Donald Trump imposed the heavy sanctions on Iran. So in the midst of this, China emerged as an extremely friendly and powerful ally for Iran because China continued to purchase oil from Iran, defying US sanctions. In fact, China, Russia and Iran also signed a $4 billion strategic pact essentially to purchase Iranian oil as well as to integrate and embed their militaries with each other. Now, the involvement of Turkey in this is also interesting because Turkey actually is a NATO member. So ideally, it should be on that side. It should be on the side of the United States of America. So why is it on the side of Russia, China, Pakistan and Iran? The reason behind this is because of the fact that relations between America and Turkey have also been deteriorating in the current years. After Turkey acquired S-400 missiles from Russia, the Trump administration slapped heavy sanctions on Turkey under the act which essentially puts sanctions on America's adversaries. So essentially, the act is essentially called CAATSA, which is Combating America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. So obviously this did really hurt Turkish economy and it did to a large extent really deteriorate relations between Turkey and America. Now the involvement of Pakistan in this also becomes important because of the involvement of Turkey in this, because essentially one of the things that Turkey does is that it supports Pakistan's actions and position in Kashmir. So India has often had problems with Turkey because it consistently threatens to internationalize the Kashmir issue. So essentially what Pakistan looks to Turkey as is it looks to Turkey as a legitimizer of its stance in Kashmir as well as a probable new leader of the Muslim world. So essentially, because of the fact that this regional security agreement does have the capacity, or is it definitely acquiring the capacity to fill up the vacuum that has been left in the Indo-Pacific by the Quad, it is obvious that because China is leading this regional security pact, it is that China is definitely on its way to arising to superpower status. As a corollary of this kind of maritime cooperation and to deal with maritime security, Russia, China and Iran are also planning to conduct joint naval drills in the Persian Gulf in 2022. According to the Russian ambassador to Iran, the reason behind this is to essentially protect or to essentially develop mechanisms to protect these extremely important international shipping lanes from sea piracy, because a lot of Iranian oil and the egress and ingress of Iranian exports and imports happens through these routes, and similar for China as well as for Russia. So obviously for all of these three nations, it is in the interest of their national security that these routes are secured. However, this decision has political significance as well. The fact that these countries have aligned with Iran in an environment where Iran is still under heavy sanctions from the USA speaks a lot in this regard. And it does speak a lot about how China is quite brazenly opposing the international norms that have been set by the USA. And China and Russia, specifically China, has also campaigned in international organizations to essentially remove sanctions on Iran and to again allow the legitimate right of Iran to trade in its oil. So essentially, it's a completely win-win perspective for everybody. Whereas, of course, Iran will gain from being able to sell its oil to both China and Russia, as well as from the borrowing that it will take from being integrated with the militaries of China and Russia. China and Russia will, of course, gain a lot of access to Iran's great resources of oil, as well as being able to gain a very powerful ally in this scenario. The final ingredient of this entire axis is the relation between China and Pakistan. Now, the relation between China and Pakistan is of extreme significance to India because Pakistan is an adversarial neighbor right on India's border, believing in completely different political ideologies. So, Pakistan and China, they look to each other to balance India in the region. Pakistan also looks to China to be able to legitimize its stance in Kashmir and China looks to Pakistan to be able to legitimize its aggressions into Indian territory in Ladakh, in Arunachal Pradesh and Himachal Pradesh. So at the basis, therefore, of China-Pakistan and deep and embedded China and Pakistan relationships is the CPEC, or the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And essentially, it was formalized in 2015 and it connects Kashgar in western China to Gwadar on the Balochistan coast in Pakistan. And it essentially is an interconnected network of heavily developed roadways, railways, fiber optic cables and gas and oil pipelines. So, Pakistan has invested heavily in Chinese infrastructure. China has invested heavily in Pakistan infrastructure to be able to develop this CPEC. Now, of course, China is not doing this purely out of benevolence. China is doing this because the CPEC provides to China two very distinct advantages. Firstly, what it provides to China is the ability to be able to transport oil directly from Gwadar to the Xinjiang province, which then has the possibility to be able to economically revitalize the Xinjiang province, which could, of course, create more economic opportunities in the region, which could reduce the insurgency that is currently, or the instability that is currently at play there. On the other hand, the CPEC also provides a very viable alternative to the Malacca Strait, through which 80% of China's trade and as well as the trade of most of the countries of the world through this region passes. So China has been for years trying to resolutely develop an alternative to the Malacca Strait because China is aware that its aggressive ambitions in the Asia Pacific could cause it to be blocked from the Malacca Strait, which would then absolutely decimate its international trade. So that's why it has been investing heavily into infrastructure and energy in this CPEC to be able to provide itself with a viable alternative. Pakistan's forays into energy has also brought China into the Eurasian oil politics. So currently what it is doing alongside the petroleum companies of Brunei and Malaysia is that it is building a 700-kilometer long gas pipeline that would connect the Gwadar port to the Sindh province, and then would basically get integrated with Pakistan's existing oil distribution network. After the sanctions on Iran, if and when they are lifted, another pipeline is currently under plans for construction, which would basically link the Gwadar port to the coast of Iran. So essentially the point here is, and in conclusion essentially, the point here is that the reason why scholars essentially believe that China is being able to emerge as a worthy contender or a worthy challenger to US unipolarity and will be able to form a sort of axis which will be able to challenge US unipolarity is because China has used all means at its disposal, both soft power as well as hard power, to present a conception, an alternative conception of the way of organizing socio-political and economic life. An alternative conception that is equally stable, equally legitimate and equally powerful to the one that has been presented by the United States of America.